A strange reality that I've had to make peace with is that people's political views on certain topics can be affected by their own sexual attraction. A really obvious and straightforward example is that if a person is gay or bisexual, they're probably less likely to support the legal repression of homosexuality since they want to engage in it. But there's also less direct forms of influence. I assume that men finding trans women attractive pushes them to be more accepting of trans people interpersonally and more supportive of trans rights politically. There's probably a good number of them who didn't even have much of an opinion on the topic, but then saw a trans woman one day, found her attractive, and then thought, oh wait, this woman's trans? Hey, maybe this trans thing isn't so bad after all. Immigration and your attraction to other races is also probably connected. I feel like people probably wouldn't admit to this if they want to be taken seriously, but there's definitely people who are less opposed to increasing immigration than they would have been otherwise because they're attracted to common immigrant groups. Try talking to a southern guy who's generally right-wing, but then also has a thing for Latinas. It's like, oh, you're not as anti-immigrant as all your friends? Wow, you don't say. Now, how should we feel about this? I don't know, I guess I have kind of conflicting feelings. Is it love triumphing over hate? Maybe. Or maybe it's just lust triumphing over prejudice or something. Of course, it can also backfire. There are men who get turned on by a trans woman and freak out, thinking, oh my god, am I gay now? They probably come at the other side even more hateful than before, because now they have something to prove. That's why some of them fixate so hard on arguing that trans women are always ugly and that they never pass. You can always tell. Who are they trying to convince, us or themselves? The original meaning of homophobia was describing not a hatred for gay people, but straight men's fear of being perceived as gay by their peers. The worse being gay is, the worse the consequences of being seen as gay will be. In some cases, they may end up being afraid that deep down they really do have some gay thoughts. After all, many men do. The theory was that any hint of sexual tension with other men, or any display of sexuality between men, would trigger a sort of internal panic. Oh god, no, I'm not gay, I'm not gay! This gets channeled into hatred, which is partially genuine, but it also doubles in function as a show, as a performance, as a way of trying to convince their peers that they aren't one of the gays. And now the same phenomenon sort of happens, but with trans women. I've talked with transphobic men who describe how horrifying it would be if they ever got tricked into doing something sexual with a trans woman. And, okay, fine, I mean, that's understandable to some extent. Nobody wants to be deceived, especially about sex. But their reaction is always a little over the top compared with most other things, or how other people would probably react to similar scenarios. If I have sex with somebody and then the next day I realize they have political opinions that I find extremely distasteful, I might regret it, but I probably wouldn't say that I was raped or traumatized over that just because they didn't tell me ahead of time. I think they also seem to find trans women passing at all to be an act of problematic deception. The question, after all, is not, what if a person lies to your face and promises she's not trans and was definitely born female? It's usually given to them more like, imagine if you had a one-night stand with some girl at a bar and then you didn't realize she was trans till afterwards. And they still react in a horrified way that reminds me of how a normal person might react if we asked them how they would feel about getting violently gang raped or something. Like, they react like this is the worst thing that could ever happen to them. And maybe you're watching this thinking, well, my reaction wouldn't be over the top, and I mean, okay, sure, I can't prove anything. I guess this is just my experience talking to people. Is being attracted to trans people a fetish? And if so, is fetishizing people bad? I'm grouping these two questions together because they seem interconnected when I try to answer them. The term fetish was used a long time ago to describe an item that people thought had some kind of mystical power, like a special amulet inhabited by spirits. Taken from this, the term sexual fetish was coined for when somebody derived a special sort of sexual gratification from an item that isn't normally sexual, like rubber boots. They're reacting as though there is something special about this item, even though to the rest of us, they're just rubber boots. There's nothing special about them. It is as though this item has some kind of special power over them that is not apparent to us through observation, kind of like the special amulet inhabited by spirits. That's right, the term was all a metaphor. Now, fetish is not the only term that has been used to describe abnormal sexual activity. There have been a few other terms along the way, such as partialism, which describes an interest in a particular body part. For example, if you were really into armpits, we might call that an armpit partialism. or the term paraphilia, intended to be a clinical catch-all for any unusual behavior. But nobody says these other terms anymore. Fetish has outlived all of its competitors, gradually broadening in how it's used to a point where now it's just a catch-all for any unusual attraction or affinity or something, kind of like how paraphilia was intended to be used. But now nobody ever says paraphilia, so forget that word. It lost the word war. A handful of words went in, and only fetish came out. So is it bad to have a particular attraction to or affinity for something? And in this context, by bad, we mean immoral or harmful. Well, the answer is obviously no, at least these days. Some people may find specific fetishes to be kinda icky, but society doesn't consider having a fetish to be you doing something wrong. In fact, it's not even an action that has moral valence because it's not a choice. It's just something that you become aware of about yourself at some point. Like being gay. That's what I would say if your fetish is something like armpits, or getting tied up, or people smoking cigarettes, or a girl peeing on you. They might be kinda icky to some people, but they're not harmful or immoral. There is, however, a glaring exception to this progressive tolerance of a wide range of sexual fetishes, which is if what you're fetishizing is trans people, or, similarly, if you're fetishizing a certain racial group. There are people who are okay with this, but it also raises some eyebrows, and some people are not okay with it. In fact, they'll condemn you for even expressing it. At a glance, it may seem like the rule is that you can be attracted to certain actions, or certain scenarios, or certain things, and even certain specific body parts, but you can't be attracted to whole identities of people. That's like objectification or something. But is that a consistent explanation? There are people who have a particular attraction to or affinity for redheads. The hair color, the pale skin, the freckles. It's an appealing look that some guys are attracted to. Is it bad that they're attracted to it? It doesn't seem like anybody considers it to be bad. In fact, not only is it not considered bad, but most people don't even talk about it as though it's a fetish at all. It's just a preference, or a particular fondness, or, oh yeah, I have a thing. I have a thing for redheads. It doesn't even get a proper label, it's just a thing. We can repeat this about numerous other outer qualities. Loving really tall women, loving men with beards, loving women with small breasts, and so on. Are any of these things fetishes? I asked around, and the answer seems to be no, none of these things are fetishes. They're just preferences. They're just things you're into. Is it because they're too normal? Is that why they're not fetishes? Are they not weird enough? Maybe. I mean, fetishes are supposed to be weird things, I guess, and those things are not sufficiently weird, so they're not quite fetishes? It's a blurry distinction. And that's where I take issue with some of this fetish talk. Why is an attraction to blonde women normal, but an attraction to Asian women is a fetish? If the thing that makes an attraction a fetish or not is weirdness, is it weird to be attracted to Asian people? Is that not effectively what we're saying? I don't think an attraction to black women seems that different from an attraction to redheads. I wouldn't have thought that either attraction is a fetish, but judging how by people treat them, it seems like one of them is. I think it's because of our history of racism. In the past, attraction to white people was the default. Of course you were attracted to white people, but attraction to black people as a white person was discouraged, looked down upon, taboo. It's like, yeah, of course blonde women are pretty. We don't need a special term or label for that. But finding black women pretty? Ugh, that must be a fetish. Interracial attraction used to be so taboo that people compared it with having a disease that warps your judgment and corrupts your sensibilities. Attraction to black people was called jungle fever, and attraction to Asian people was called yellow fever. Not because white people thought that black people came from a jungle and that Asian people looked yellow, but because these were the names of actual diseases at the time. Malaria and other diseases like that were called jungle fever, and yellow fever, well, that's actually just the name of the disease. So it's not quite as stupid as it sounds at first, but it's still pretty stupid. Even when relatively forward-thinking people today label interracial attraction a fetish, they're effectively discouraging you from being honest about your feelings and implicitly belittling the object of your attraction for being a different race from you. Think about what's being said. Attraction to people of your race? Normal. Attraction to people of a different race? Fetish. Is this progressive? The experience of being fetishized. People who have been the victims of racism may feel uneasy about being fetishized by members of the same group that normally mistreats them. This is because there's a real history of fetishization not counteracting prejudice and abuse, but merely accompanying it, though perhaps giving motivation to at least kind of hide the prejudice and abuse for a little bit. Through experience, people may learn that members of their oppressor class, whoever that may be, who normally want nothing to do with you, suddenly swinging hard in the opposite direction and trying to sleep with you, can be, let's say, tricky. As it turns out, sexually pleasuring somebody doesn't guarantee they're going to be your ally outside of the bedroom, in case the whole history of misogyny didn't make that clear enough already. Let's imagine a man is really attracted to Asian women. It's possible that he goes after any random Asian woman he sees. He doesn't really bother trying to get to know them as people, because who cares? Their only purpose for him is to satisfy his fetish. He doesn't need to be with this or that Asian woman, he just needs to be with an Asian woman. If one breaks up with him, he'll just ask out the very next one that he comes across. In this way, he treats the women he's with as replaceable and interchangeable commodities. For the women he's pursuing, this might not be apparent at first, and if not at first, when they do realize it, that realization can be rather painful. This is, roughly speaking, the narrative for why fetishization is bad. The problem with this description so far is that we could repeat this without any reference to race. We're just describing a man who's only interested in women for sex. Why does it matter if he also has a thing for her racial group? This would be like if we had a special name for the distinct act of murdering a person who has a different hair color from yours. Why are we calling it something like it's just murder, right? Like, are we focusing on the wrong aspects of the scenario? The difference is that for white women, a man's intentions is an open question. If a man is sexually attracted to you, then he could also be interested in you as a person and want to form a serious relationship. But if you're a racial minority in a racist society where interracial relationships are taboo, that might not be a realistic option. So if a white man is sexually attracted to you, it's probably just about the sex, because the rest is definitely not happening. In minority communities, young girls are warned by their mothers about men from the majority group, because it becomes something of a trap. If you're so used to the majority mistreating you, but then one comes along who's not mistreating you, and you want to take that as an indication that he's different, well, really, he might not be. He's just masking his racism because he wants to fuck you, and then he'll go back to being just like everybody else. This is not something that white girls have to think about. Now, the experience that I'm describing gives rise to a second meaning of fetishize or fetishization. When some people talk about fetishization, what they mean is not merely having a particular attraction to or affinity for something, but the act of treating somebody in a very shallow way, only seeing them as a vehicle for satisfying that attraction. A person might even say something like, it's okay to be attracted to Asian women, but you shouldn't fetishize them. And what they mean by that is roughly, you shouldn't completely miss the individual and only view her as or praise her for being an Asian woman and talk about how much you love Asian women as a group, because that makes it seem like your appreciation for her is that shallow and that you're more interested in her category than in her as a person, which kind of betrays that your view is, and also makes her feel as though she is just a replaceable Asian woman commodity to you. This level of detail and nuance might not make its way into common speech. Instead, all you get is, don't fetishize her, which different people end up interpreting to mean different things. The issue is that as much as I'm able to understand where the apprehension about being fetishized in this sense comes from, there's really no reason that these two different meanings of fetishization are inseparable. And there's a constant mix-up between people using fetish to mean a particular attraction to or affinity for, and other people using it for the second meaning, which is shallowly using somebody to satisfy your particular attraction. And it's really only the latter that seems like a problem. Though you could argue in a society that's overwhelmingly prejudiced against a certain group, we could probably expect to find the second anywhere that we find the first. That is to say, a person who fetishizes a minority in the first sense is at risk of also doing so in the second. But in so many cases today, that just isn't how it is anymore, and it makes no sense to act as though it is the case. If we don't think that any of the people involved are actually racist, then I don't know why it matters if somebody says they have a fetish for Asians or a fetish for Latinas or whatever. Or the minorities who have a fetish for white people, by the way. That's also a big thing. Actually, I'll go even one step further and say that even if a person is racist to some extent, like if they have some ingrained racism in the back of their mind from their upbringing, or they feel some kind of taboo about being with a person from another race, maybe because your racist parents wouldn't approve, that doesn't necessarily make it harmful either. It can be self-aware and even productive, as in helping to develop better attitudes by using sexual play to engage with what is otherwise an uncomfortable topic. It really just depends on how both participants approach it, and as long as they're being honest with themselves, I don't see the issue. Transgender fetishism. This was actually the very first thing that I wanted to talk about, but I took a garden path on the way there. Hello there, nice to meet you. In case you're not aware, I am a transsexual woman. There are people who fetishize trans women. Some of them feel guilty about it and some of them don't. Should I treat people like this as a threat to me? Should I treat them with distrust? Should I act like they're doing something wrong by feeling the way they do? That's what a lot of trans people do. The men who express an interest in us are labeled trans chasers, or just chasers for short, and they are a kind of villain in the trans community. Now, from the outside looking in, this may be a confusing affair. Trans people spend all this time wanting to be accepted, seeking approval and validation, but then a man comes along and says that he wants us, and we call him a fetishist and treat him like he's gross. What is our problem? Do we want normal men to be attracted to us, or don't we? The answer is that it's a similar caution as what racial minorities experience. There's a worry that ultimately this person will be just as transphobic as the rest of people in society. They're just hiding it for a minute to lure us in. I've even heard some people define a trans chaser as a transphobic person who fetishizes trans people, which I guess makes sense from their point of view. This all gets wrapped up in the history of trans representation and the way that normal people are likely to still conceive of trans women as a result. For decades, the average person did not know the term transgender or transsexual. That didn't really come into the mainstream until the 2010s. Instead, they were crossdressers or they were transvestites, which is just a fancier way to say crossdresser. And crossdressing was kind of associated with crazy people. It was occasionally featured in movies like Psycho or Silence of the Lambs. Then eventually the adult film industry rolled into town, and dudes on pornography websites would start getting offered videos featuring trannies, she-males, ladyboys, and dick girls. If you were into anime around this time, you might have learned about something called fuda, which is the same concept. Now in 2015, there were some big leaps in trans representation. That's when Caitlyn Jenner came out as trans, that's when the I Am Jazz show started airing on TLC. There was also a movie called Tangerine, which was about two transsexual prostitutes. It's been difficult for us to get away from the slutty pornographic sex worker association, though to be fair, a lot of trans people kind of play into it. The fact that so many people became aware of our very existence through pornography means that the whole being perceived as an interchangeable sex commodity is an even more literal reality for trans people than it was for other groups. These websites advertised us like mythical creatures, like fantasy objects come to life. It's like if your fetish was that you wanted to fuck a centaur or something. They're kinda like women, but with a twist. An observation that reinforces this dynamic is how many people who would self-describe as having a trans fetish, or being into trans women, or however they word it, explicitly having a preference for pre-op trans women, or even saying that they would only be interested in pre-op trans women. Think about why this might be the case. I can imagine innocent reasons that a person might have a preference, but it also comes off very much like, if you don't have a dick, then what's the point? I could just go get a cis woman instead. And I do think that's their mindset a lot of the time. For a lot of men, that special little surprise downstairs is the only thing that makes us remotely special or interesting. Without it, we're just a strict downgrade. We're just like a cis woman, but worse. I feel like that's effectively what people who say things like this are conveying. I think it's also worth noting that guys like this will react negatively to a trans woman who talks about wanting to get bottom surgery. They'll even try to talk her out of it, and of course they'll react negatively to hearing about a trans woman who got bottom surgery. Once upon a time, a dude literally wrote, "A trans girl without her penis is like an angel without its wings," and trans people have memed about it ever since. Well, I mean, some of us have. Trans women are an emotionally vulnerable demographic. We're likely to be depressed or anxiety-ridden, we're insecure about how we look, we have issues with our families. A guy swooping in and just finding us really attractive can be amazing. It can feel amazing. But at the same time, that can open the door for a lot of manipulation and abuse, because you'll give somebody like this a lot of leeway when you're desperate. And there are guys who act like they're doing us a favor just by being attracted to us. Like they realize that makes them really valuable to us, and then we owe them one. And they revel in what that position allows them to get away with. So honestly, yeah, some level of caution is warranted. Okay, then what am I supposed to do, you ask? For the most part, just don't act in the ways that I've already described. I don't think there's really that high a bar beyond that. I don't think most trans women desire any kind of special praise or emphasis on the fact that they're trans. There is probably a right way to do it if you're careful and if she already knows and trusts you and your intentions. But calling it out has a high risk of making us nervous because it sounds like you're viewing us through a fundamentally different lens from the one that you'd see cis women through, which probably isn't what she wants. I think that trans women have a unique sort of inferiority complex where we compare ourselves disfavorably with cis women, who at the same time represent the standard that we're trying to live up to. So if your goal is to avoid making us feel bad, then you should probably avoid implying that you could just go get a cis woman instead and that would be an upgrade for you, implying that you resorted to being with trans women because getting a cis woman was too difficult, implying that you settled for us because we were easier, implying that you oh so charitably decided to overlook us being trans and offer yourself despite that glaring downside on our part. If you don't say any mean or devaluing things like this that kind of make us sad, then yeah, I don't really see the downside of anybody having a fetish for us, as in having a particular attraction or affinity or thing for us, right? It just becomes this like, okay, so there's like something about trans women that you find attractive? Okay. Okay, final question. Does trans fetishism move society in a more accepting direction? In some cases, guys accidentally realizing that they find a trans woman attractive does push them away if they're predisposed to homophobia. And I'm not sure how we would measure to make this comparison, like really scientifically or whatever, but my intuition, my guess, my feeling of the matter is that men finding us attractive seems to apply far more pressure in the pro-acceptance direction than the reverse. The growing popularity of trans women in pornography, which is now being offered as a category to men who visit general pornography websites, instead of being locked away in some niche website separate from everything else, has resulted in a lot more men looking at this category than are likely to admit it. And this probably pushes people to be more open-minded because it challenges their own ideas about gender and sexuality. Because if you're a man and you honestly find this stuff attractive, then you're kind of forced to accept either that you're not straight or that she's a woman. I actually wonder if you could go back in time like 100 years and just flood the market with pornography of attractive black women, do you think that would make white people less racist? Like, do you think maybe the civil rights movement would have been successful sooner if all the white people were attracted to the black women? No, I'm not going to commit to saying that that would be the case. I think it's very possible that there are some dynamics when it comes to trans women that doesn't apply equally well to racial differences. But whatever, I don't know. This all feels really weird to talk about either way, and I mean, it would be pretty neat if we could live in a world where your rights are not in any way affected by whether or not you get people's dicks hard, but it is what it is.